With the recent announcement of Total War Saga Troy, the discussion around naval battles has cropped up again. Troy will not feature naval battles, and the Total War community are somewhat divided on this. The argument that's often put forward against naval battles is that in recent games, they haven't performed well. They've been buggy, slow, clunky, and generally just not that fun. Scrapping this cumbersome game mode would probably be a net benefit to the development team, who could focus their efforts elsewhere instead. There was also a common myth propagated by fans surrounding Total War Warhammer that Games Workshop held a specific license for naval battles, which turned out not to be true when a Creative Assembly developer stated that there's no license issue, they just don't have the resources. The argument in favor of naval battles is that in a few particular games they were very enjoyable, most notably Empire, Napoleon, and Fall of the Samurai. These were all the gunpowder era games, with large sailing ships firing broadside cannons over long distances. The non-gunpowder era games do vary in terms of fan reception, with Shogun 2 and Attila being considered some of the best renditions only by a minority of the audience though, and Rome 2 being kind of universally considered the worst. The response to the argument of scrapping the battle type in favor of more resources elsewhere is often met with the example of Three Kingdoms removing the battle type but seemingly not replacing it with anything. At least for Total War Warhammer, the case can be made that unique races received much more depth in that game, although it did come at the hefty cost of several battle types such as the naval battles, river crossings, fort battles, open settlement battles, and a seemingly less ambitious siege system. Now since then, river crossings have made their way back in with Warhammer 2. So let's go through the history of the games and look at each rendition of naval battles. We'll start with Empire Total War. Empire was an extremely ambitious project for Creative Assembly. Their UK studio had just wrapped up Rome Total War, and then they'd been purchased by Sega. Sega commissioned an external development studio in Australia to make Medieval 2, while Creative Assembly's UK team began working on a new engine to support the franchise well into the future. Fun fact, they're still using and modifying that same engine today in all of their games. Rome 2, Warhammer 2, Arena, Three Kingdoms, many little issues and legacy bugs can all be traced back to Empire. But that aside, one of the biggest new additions to Creative Assembly's biggest game ever was naval battles. No longer when two fleets met at sea would auto-resolve be the only option. Now you could take to the water in a whole new battle type with over 30 types of ship. The ships each had their own count of guns and varying numbers of crew. They fired in different directions, at different ranges, with different ammo types and rates of fire. They were affected by wind, depending on their size, and they also served unique purposes such as trade, speed, firepower, or boarding actions when in battle. The gameplay of these battles consisted of heavy maneuvering, attempting to outrange your opponents, sinking the enemy, capturing their ships through boarding actions, or surrounding them until they surrendered. It was extremely micro-intensive to manage, especially at scale. You could manually fire your broadsides, which was very difficult to get right, but very rewarding once you got familiar with the ship distances and learned to manage their formations. The ships also typically had multiple ammo types with varying uses. Cannon shot was the default, a long distance kind of all-rounder meant for damaging the hull of a ship. You had chain shot, which was medium range designed to disable the masts of enemy ships, which reduced their speed or held them in place. And then grape shot was a devastating close-range blast designed to kill onboard infantry. The wind direction was a major gameplay element in the battles. Managing it effectively could give you a significant advantage in battle. Having the wind behind you increased your speed and maneuverability, and it also meant that any range advantage you already had over your enemy counted for more, as they would slowly plod their way towards you against the wind while you fired on them. However, pushing against the wind yourself almost felt akin to fighting uphill in a land battle. You had less options and you'd be at a disadvantage. The wind direction could shift subtly over time, which forced ships to move and think about how to use it, though in a typical battle, ships would end up crossing paths and the wind direction will become a lot less relevant as the battle got more chaotic. Gameplay aside, what really set Empire's naval battles apart was the details. When zooming in, you could see different crew on the ships working the sails, steering, manning the guns, and several musketeers keeping watch. The captain could often be spotted climbing to the top of the ship and proudly clasping his hands behind his back, an animation that's just reserved for him. The ships all had their own damage models, with holes in their sails, masts breaking apart or tipping over, ships sinking in various ways or even exploding. When ships began going down, several people would cling to the ship for life and jump last second, or they would jump overboard immediately. The game also had really impressive boarding and melee combat on opposing vessels. Ropes would be thrown over and ships slowly pulled together by the crew. They raised their sails and planks got thrown down to allow them to cross. Troops then began shimmying over the planks, and others would use ropes to climb their way across where they engaged in melee. Not every crew had weapons, so you'll see some engaged in fistfights or take out clubs. Once they were done and one side surrendered, they returned to the ship by jumping over and disembarking for a quick escape. It was incredible detail, far beyond anything we've ever seen in a Total War game before. These battles are still considered the best aspect of Empire Total War, a game that arguably still has the worst battle AI to date in any Total War game, but on the open sea, pathfinding could be largely ignored, and the AI would do a really great job of isolating enemy ships and overwhelming them. The battles themselves, of course, would be nothing without context on the campaign. The campaign in Empire incentivized you very heavily to build navies. Of course, there was the multiple theaters that required navies to get troops from A to B across the Atlantic, but there was also the naval-only theaters with predefined trade nodes. These were valuable hotspots that only one fleet could occupy at a time, which led to wars being declared for the valuable nodes. If smaller fleets couldn't do battle for the nodes themselves, they could instead attack the trade route, requiring secondary fleets to then protect the trade that would lead back home. So that's Empire's naval battles in a nutshell, regarded as a pretty successful introduction of a new battle type to the franchise, and one fans would expect to see return in its follow-up. Which brings us to Napoleon Total War. Less than a year after Empire in 2010, Creative Assembly released a brand new game solely focused around the events of one man's life. This was not a standalone expansion, instead, it was marketed and sold as a full game with several of its own unique additions and DLCs for pre-ordering. Creative Assembly would eventually go on to call these types of games follow-up titles to their tentpole mainline titles, moving away from the expansion model present with their previous games and instead creating bespoke games, each with their own slews of DLC. It was the beginning of Total War receiving annual boxed releases. So, Napoleon's Naval Warfare was essentially the same as Empire's, as it was a follow-up title, though it did introduce later era ships that packed bigger firepower. There was also hybrid steam power and sail ships that didn't rely as heavily on the wind to move around, so that added a bit of another dynamic for the late game units too. And some ships also had a new repair ability that let you patch up some of the damage and get a bit of a second wind during the battle. One of the complaints of Empire's naval battles was that it was often the bigger navy that won, so these extra abilities and ammo types, as well as the new ship classes like ironclads and bomb ships, really increased the back and forth that was possible. The game maintained its quality in terms of aesthetics from Empire, reusing the detailed animations from that game, but it also increased the visual fidelity of particle effects and reflections, as well as introducing new era-appropriate sounds for the ships and their firepower. Almost exactly 1 year later, in 2011, Creative Assembly released Total War Shogun 2, a game set in feudal Japan, polar opposite to the almost global ambitions of Empire, and instead winding the clock back 200 years and focusing on the era where Total War first got its start. Shogun 2 continued on from Empire and Napoleon, featuring their own take on naval battles, largely featuring the Ataki Boon ship, or just Boon for short. These ships came in varying sizes, light, medium and heavy, but largely they all operated the same, with a focus on ranged missiles, with a 360-degree angle of fire. As missile fire was mostly relegated to just archers, ships were then forced closer together due to their limited attack range. This exaggerated the clunkiness of ship maneuverability, especially routing ships that were out of the player's control. They would often cross paths and get stuck with colliding on each other. This largely took away a lot of the strategic maneuvering of Empire Napoleon, where you would gauge the wind to get a good lineup with your broadsides at distance. Wind was present in Shogun II's naval battles, but its importance was heavily reduced as the ships were operated by rowers beneath the decks, so the effect on ship speed was still minimal in comparison to previous games. The clunkiness was further compounded with the new naval maps, which often featured islands and outcroppings, and while strategically and visually they were an excellent addition, they suffered from buggy pathfinding of AI ships getting caught on one another. As the ships were primarily tall and wooden structures, fire played a bigger role, with some missile ships having fire capabilities on timed cooldowns. This built upon the repairability of Napoleon and gave some element of timing and pacing to the battles. Repair made a return, as well as some extra abilities such as faster rowing and faster reloading. Late game, there were several ships that used matchlock infantry instead of archers, packing a bigger punch but lowering the reload time, and there was also the bulky cannon ship, which did fire makeshift broadside gameplay. However, manual fire was removed from them, and automatic attacks usually led to the ship not turning to face their target, so ended up being quite micro-intensive to use. On the detail side of things, there were some slight drawbacks. Troops still moved and walked around the ships, but none of them actually interacted with it anymore. They were also essentially a copy of the land units instead of unique naval infantry just for the ships. Gone were the numerous crew tending to the decks, there was no actual rowers. When boarding actions happened, there was no rope climbing or special animations. Instead, the troops just used their wall climb animation from sieges to scale the walls of the enemy ships. When ships sank, they all jumped overboard at the same time, no longer clinging on till the last moments before the ship submerged. Despite these minor drawbacks, it was still visually great, and an area in which it improved, or at least maintained the detail of previous games, was in the ship's damage models, which got progressively more and more worn as they took fire, while bits of wood chipped off and fell in the water. The battles could be quite fun and enjoyable when they occurred, however ship rosters were limited to around 12 ship types, and there was only 6 trade nodes on the campaign map on the extreme edges. This meant that naval battles were few and far between, and also rarely not that worth it for most clans on the map. 1 year later, in 2012, Shogun II Fall of the Samurai was released, moving forward to the latest time period Total War has ever covered, 1864. In this setting, Western influence has taken hold and ironclads have made it to Japan. The naval roster was completely overhauled and increased to over 20 ship types now, featuring torpedo boats, gunboats, corvettes, frigates, and as mentioned, ironclads. Wind at this point practically played no effect on these ships, as they were all steam powered in the battles. Despite having masts and sails, they didn't use them during the actual fights. The battle gameplay for navies was vastly improved here over Shogun II. The ships each had 5 settings, which mimicked a sort of engine power to move faster or slow down, which helped ships maintain a constant speed that you could easily predict. Manual fire for broadsides was reintroduced, and aiming from the front became available, and a new first-person mode that let you get down in the action and fire on other ships with a direct aimer was added. The timed battle abilities of Shogun II returned, with increased speed and overheating the engine, reload times, repairs, and you could still board. However, boarding doesn't occur very often. The ships are so powerful, often when they get that close together, they just destroy each other, and half of the roster can't be boarded. It was just disallowed. When it came to the details, there was a slight improvement over Shogun II. The ships now had 2 types of troops on board, the matchlock infantry and then the more crew type infantry that carry swords. They operated the cannons and walked around a bit, giving some life to the ship, but it's still a bit of a far cry from Empire's captains, deck crew, melee and gunners that would all do different things, such as climbing the masts or manning different aspects of the ships. It was visually better than Shogun II though. The ships felt a little bit more alive, and the ships themselves were incredibly detailed and had their own unique animations, sounds and damage models. A nice bit of added atmosphere was that when ships exploded, they now flung crewmen off in all different directions, and the same would happen when a glancing explosive shot hit the deck, sending the crewmates flying into the water. Completely over the top perhaps, but it was a real visual treat. Not much changed in Fall of the Samurai on the campaign for navies, however trade nodes were now removed and instead entry points from other nations were added. Trade could still be interrupted by raiding a specific trade route, and now ships had the ability of providing off-map artillery support in battles with naval bombardment of coastal and nearby settlements. It was ridiculously strong. A year and a half later, in late 2013, we arrive at the release of Total War Rome 2, the most ambitious Total War to date. The first battle demo hinged on a new battle type, the combined land and sea battle. Now you could use your navies to land on the coastline, unload your troops, and fight the rest of the battle on land. These combined battles presented a situation where the navy could enter the port of a city while a siege assault was going on outside of it, showcasing unprecedented scale for the franchise. Naval units were shown to have multiple ships per unit, and a new type of naval warfare that focused on a mix of ramming, melee, and missile combat. Now with the added incentive of protecting your ports, it seemed naval battles would reach new levels of importance. Unfortunately, the gameplay turned out to be extremely buggy. Ramming often just didn't work, with ships getting stuck right before they began a ram, or failing to pull back to enable a second ram. There was no official row backwards option, though sometimes it would happen, making it nearly impossible to pull off a second ram if the enemy was moving. Boarding actions also bugged out regularly, with troops leaping from ship to ship instead of using planks like in older games. This often resulted in units getting caught or stuck, preventing the ships from disengaging. It also led to troops jumping to their death when they thought they were boarding a ship, but instead were jumping into the ocean. Wind and weather didn't play any effect on ship maneuverability, as the ships kept their sails furled at all times, and fire arrows were a permanent option now rather than a timed cooldown, removing the careful timing of the ability. Abilities in general were largely removed, with no repair abilities or ammo abilities anymore. However, there was speed abilities still, with variations on power depending on the size of ship. Ship variety was pretty good, with special firepot ships and artillery ships that shook up the close range and long range aspects of the battle, but they were often met with balance issues where a single artillery piece could sink an entire fleet, especially if the first person aiming feature was used. When it came to the combined land and sea battles, AI was primarily the issue, with ships having one permanent docking space. The AI would queue up its ships to dock all at the same spot, but each time the spot became blocked, it would move further down the coast until it found the next spot. The issue being that ships were either left stuck out at sea forever if the maps didn't have enough slots for them, or their units were cut down one by one as they arrived in a disjointed fashion. This was later patched 4 years after the game came out, so that ships would eventually pull away after their troops disembarked, as they would later do so a year later in Total War Attila. In some extreme cases around the first 6 months of launch, naval battles saw ships bug through the ground and travel through maps to arrive at their docking points. Or see the AI just sit out at sea where you could not engage them, running the clock down if there was one, or if there wasn't, you just had to concede defeat. When the AI wasn't an issue, some fun could still be had with naval battles in multiplayer after several patches, but ultimately it never lived up to the hype. The scale was reduced, so there was only one ship per unit again, and docking on piers was impossible. Instead, little beaches inside the ports were added to some maps to allow it. When it came to the details, the battle type was really underdeveloped compared to its predecessors. There was no specific naval infantry models at all, there was no crew or anyone spotting, using the rigging or anything like that. Oarsmen could never be seen even when the ship snapped in half to reveal its empty internal husk. There was no planks or corvus for attacking ships, no ropes or anything used to pull them together, save for one interesting ship artillery piece that could actually fire a rope into another ship and use that to pull the ships together. I've never seen this until someone sent it to me when they knew I was making this video. Apparently that's a thing. It's actually really cool, but it's never used. Instead, troops would just bunny hop from one to the other. The ships themselves actually looked great, with various painted details to reflect the different cultures, but they had a limited amount of damage models, with no massed damage, or no longer would chunks of the ship break off and float in the ocean as was the standard since Empire. In some circumstances, ships would sink and the crew would even be oblivious to it, just going down with the ship staring into the distance. On the campaign, trade nodes were still removed, and the ability to interrupt trade routes was also removed and replaced with a broader raiding stance, which didn't draw navies close together, but instead led to a tedious cat and mouse around the ocean. It heavily de-incentivized naval gameplay. However, coastal settlements could now be captured with navies, which did encourage it for quick auto-resolve victories against defenseless coastlines. Total War Rome 2 was the first major stumbling block for naval battles, a feature that was panned in reviews and ignored by players. Creative Assembly may have looked at the feature at this time as something that hindered development and the Metacritic of the game rather than something that improved it. The combined land and sea battle was essentially a failure. It was soon after this that Creative Assembly began development of Total War Warhammer when they split their teams. 2014 marks the first gap year in Total War's annualized release schedule, most likely due to the extra patching time needed for Rome 2. Total War Arena, a free-to-play multiplayer title originally tied to Rome 2's pre-order, did eventually reveal itself in late 2014 to a select group of YouTubers in a playable alpha. It did not feature any naval gameplay. 18 months, 15 patches and 11 DLCs after Rome 2, Total War Attila released in February of 2015. The game was another character-centric follow-up to a more mainline title, and as such shared much of the assets with its predecessor. Naval Battles did see some innovations though. Ships became much more specialized in their own categories. Now there were specific ships just for ramming, for melee, and variations on missiles, each of which came equipped with unique timed abilities similar to Shogun 2, such as replenishing ammo when it ran out, dousing fires, speeding up, improving melee, and improving the rate of fire. Generally, ramming worked much better due to increased turning speeds and a sort of semi-automated row backwards mechanic, where if you clicked behind your ship, the ship would row backwards as long as it was within a certain radius. Ramming also resulted in auto-ramming, which meant the ship would automatically pull back and repeatedly attempt a ram on its own. However, this was prone to missing its target if the target was actually moving. Wind was still not a factor, and despite the emphasis on sails and fire, it was more just in place to represent how damaged the ship was. The speed of ships was never actually altered, regardless of the weather conditions, or if the sails were intact or fully burned away. You could argue that this was probably because they still used oarsmen. Melee combat and boarding still used the Rome 2 method of jumping from ship to ship, and once a ship engaged another in melee, both ships would now suddenly come to a hard stop to allow for a more bug-free transition, preventing troops from jumping into the ocean if the ships were still moving. In terms of the details, there was the new fire tech with sails on display, but apart from that, it was basically Rome 2 from a details perspective, with no new boarding or combat animations or any atmosphere animations like crewmen, oarsmen, captains, or ways for men to traverse the ships. Ships, as a result, felt like static vessels that carried troops on them, rather than units in their own right. Bugs in Attila were certainly way less common than Rome 2, such as ships no longer getting stuck on the beaches, but the AI did occasionally get stuck on their own ships or get locked into melee forever, unable to disengage, rendering your ship stuck fighting any enemy you can't target with anyone else. The more common instances of these bugs were mostly patched several months after release. On the campaign, not much changed for navies. Trade nodes still didn't exist or any points of interest for trade, nor did the ability to directly raid a trade route or draw ships together. The incentive to use ships was primarily to assault undefended ports and to move troops vast distances slightly faster than normal, but for most of the part, the Mediterranean was largely empty in Total War Attila due to the nature of the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire not starting with any fleets. Around 14 months after the release of Total War Attila, Total War Warhammer released in 2016 without the naval battle type, nor any naval-specific units on the campaign. In a Q&A on Reddit, the community asked why there was naval unit cards found in the database. The game's lead producer at the time responded and stated that, quote, "We had planned to have campaign navies, note this is very different from naval battles, but cut it during development when we found that with the current landmass, navies were very unimportant and added unnecessary complexity," end quote. This meant that for the first time in 8 years, naval battles were auto-resolve only, and for the first time in 11 years, the game didn't even feature any types of naval units on the campaign. A year later, in 2017, Total War Warhammer 2 released with a new campaign map which heavily featured a giant ocean in its center, and also featured a new map that combined the old world and the new world together with a vast ocean in between if you owned both games. Despite this, there was still no addition of naval units on the campaign map or fully real-time naval battles. There was no official word from Creative Assembly this time around as to why. A lot of fans had come to Creative Assembly's defense, propagating a myth about license conflicts with Games Workshop not allowing Creative Assembly to do it. Practically every thread about naval battles from 2015 to late 2017 would be shut down by numerous people arguing the same thing, aggressively stating that it was the Man of War game that prevented Creative Assembly from doing it. Many of these threads were highly visible on Steam, Reddit, and Total War's official forums, and Creative Assembly never responded to it until late 2017 when, during an interview at Gamescom, a developer responded by saying it's not to do with Man of War, but rather that they have finite resources. 8 months after the release of Total War Warhammer 2, Total War Saga Thrones of Britannia released as a sort of smaller Total War game with a focus on the British Isles during the Viking Age. Using Total War Attila as a framework, Thrones did have naval battles, but did not feature naval units or navies in general, but instead they used transport ships to allow ship-to-ship fighting using Total War Attila's naval battle system. However, with just open transports, the combat was vastly simplified, where ships would just connect with each other and engage in melee combat, with missiles firing from afar. The audio was greatly improved to add more atmosphere to the battles here, but there was no real unique gameplay. There was no wind for interesting maneuvers, ramming, ship types with special abilities, or any unique units at sea. Combined battles did see a return where transports could then unload their troops on beaches to assault settlements, but bugs present in older titles resurfaced, such as navies unable to dock, AI not being able to figure out where to go, or troops jumping back into the ocean.
See, they flee before our might. Flee before our might.
1 year later, in May 2019, Total War 3 Kingdoms released with no naval battles or naval units. When asked why, Creative Assembly's official response was, quote, "It's really about the conflict on the mainland, so we're not simulating naval battles," end quote. Despite mentioning that they were inspired by the Romance of the Three Kingdoms novel and using reference work from Red Cliff, both of which feature major turning points in the war decided by naval battles, that wasn't enough to develop them for the game. In late 2019, Total War Saga Troy was announced. In the announcement, Creative Assembly said that there would be no naval battles in their FAQ, as there is little documentation of Trojan naval warfare. In the game, however, which is built on the Warhammer 2 framework, naval battles will trigger a land battle that appears to be a sort of island. This was a feature added later to a patch in Warhammer 2 alongside their Vampire Pirates DLC to alleviate player frustration with the auto-resolve. So that's really it for the history of naval battles in the Total War franchise. Over time, they became more and more simplified, with the occasional investment here and there into certain features, but largely the gameplay and atmosphere was reduced to the point where parts of the fanbase no longer care if it's included or not. Creative Assembly have shown that they can change their reasons for ignoring the battle type time and time again. With Warhammer, it was because it didn't make much sense for the landmass, but then with Warhammer 2, when the landmass argument didn't make sense anymore, it was then because it cost too much. when there's no unique races or species to attribute those costs to with a game like Three Kingdoms, they simply say they're not doing them. When a largely mythological Total War comes by with Total War Troy, suddenly it's the historical documentation that is the reason we don't see it. When providing no answer, fans will propagate myths about license conflicts that don't make any sense, with years passing by until it's addressed, not by a communications team, but by a developer at an event. The real reason, as I see it, is what the developer stated for Warhammer 2 in that interview, when they probably shouldn't have. They have finite resources, and those resources are seemingly getting a little bit tighter over time. As the franchise has become annualized, the developers have less time to make their games and are given smaller budgets to make games like Thrones of Britannia, a smaller spin-off Total War with a hefty price tag. The franchise proudly announces its record high sales with every new release, but then renames their old catalogue of games and raises their prices in the back end. I love it when a company whose games I enjoy does well, I really do, but I just wish they would reinvest back into their product and stop lying about why they don't. Release Warhammer 3 and then just go away for 2 years, maybe even 3, make the next big engine, increase the scale, increase the quality, and listen to the fans. And it'll help the developers. They'll have more time, they'll have more creative freedom, and they'll create a better product. We will get a better game that way. That's it for the video. I hope you enjoyed this look at the history of naval battles of the franchise. Please consider leaving a like if you enjoyed it, share it with someone you think may enjoy it, and consider supporting this channel over on Patreon so I can do more stuff like this. This video was exclusive to patrons for a short while and wouldn't have been possible without them. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.